And before we calculate this and continue any further, I do want to take a look at a couple other things. And mainly, I do want to change the name of the main EV, which should be HV, emitter. So I'm going to go ahead and change to the schematic view and just change that to HV. And it looks like I typed it in wrong a little bit earlier. Go back to our camera view. And if we go to our properties, what I also want to do is go to our low poly collision. And just on the bottom where we can see the new group, I just want to make sure that that is set to default and not the HV group in case it was set on that. Because we don't need to be changing any of these particles over to other groups unless we want to expand upon the overall effect that we want to get out of our particles. But I'm just going to scrub through just to a little bit later in the animation where we can see our particles. And I just want to take a look at some of the HV effects before we calculate this and eventually get it to the point where it's workable and we can calculate those particles and save them, and that way we don't need to have the processor calculating that every single time we scrub through the animation. We can just sort of bake that animation onto those particles and load them in. It'll be a lot easier to work with that way. So what we want to do is just open up our Viper, and then also we can hit Control F6 to pull up our volumetrics, and what we want to do is add in our HyperVoxels. And I'm going to turn off volumetric anti-aliasing right now, mainly just to speed up renders while we're doing any test renders, because that is something that we really don't need on while we're creating the base shapes of HyperVoxels and a lot of the startup things. So we can double click on there to open up our HyperVoxels 3.0 window. I'm going to double click on our main HV emitter, and now we can start to see those particles showing up. And what I'm going to do is change our preview size to 640 by 480, and that way we can really see what's going on in the scene. But you notice that right now of course, since we're just using Viper and there's no background, we can't really see where the terrain is at. And now, if we rendered this with our view scene, the view scene would not show up because that is not going to be embedded into our Viper preview. So what we can do is make a couple of modifications to our scene just to refresh Viper, and that'll help us and really aid us in the creation of our particles for HyperVoxels. And what we need to do for that is go to our objects, and we're going to select first our low poly, which is our collision object. And now, since we have that set, we really don't need to look at the collision object anymore. I'm going to turn up its object dissolve to 100%, and we can pretty much leave it there. I'm going to switch over to our terrain valley, which is the much higher resolution, and change our object dissolve down to 0. And now we can see that full resolution. And what I want to do now is go to our view scene and increase the object dissolve to 100%. And that way we will not render the view scene, or we shouldn't. And another thing we could do just to make sure that that's not rendering is just check off xStream in our volumetrics. And that'll really make sure that it is not rendering and showing up. Let's go to our camera properties, and we can see we're set at custom right now, that 800 by 450, and that should be alright. Of course, our Viper is 640 by 480, which is a 4 by 3 resolution, but it still should show up correctly. So let's go ahead to our render. And since we already opened Viper, we know that it's going to save it to that scene. And what we can do is just render a frame. And now we can see our terrain showing up along with our current HyperVoxels. And if we open up Viper, and we want to show all objects, and right now that preview is not showing up, so what I'm going to do is turn off our HyperVoxels right now, and making sure that Viper's still open. I'm going to render out another frame. And it seems that we're not able to show that preview except when we have surfaces, just for modifying surfaces. But once we do the HV, we can't really see that. But that's okay. We'll be able to render that out fairly quickly. So let's go back to our objects and change the dissolve down to 0 for our view scene. And then also go back to our volumetrics tab and just turn xStream back on. And go back into HyperVoxels. And now we can define exactly what we want these HyperVoxels to look like. One thing I do want to do is have a stretch direction. I'm going to change that to velocity. And now what that's going to do is stretch our HyperVoxels in the direction in which they're moving. We can also stretch them on specific axes, but since we're moving on more than one axis and in different directions, the best effect is really going to come from the velocity amount. And then you can increase the stretch amount, which you can see what we had circles before are now starting to stretch out into more of an oblong shape. And we can set this up for a couple of different types of effects. We could have this be water, where it's flowing through our scene, and almost as if a dam broke in the valley and now all the water is rushing through. We could set it up to be smoke and look like smoke in order to have maybe a volcano in the area, or we could have a lava flow. So there's lots of things we could do with it. I'm going to go to our presets, and we could just choose some of the available presets that just come with Lightwave. And I'm going to select our smoke and just load that in. And right now, that's not really lit up correctly. So we're going to go to the shading for this, and we want to select our view light. And that way we're using the exact same light to light our HyperVoxels as we are the rest of our scene, and that way everything matches up correctly. And I'm going to switch this to a normal mode and get out of draft, and that way we can see what's going on a little bit better. And now one thing you might notice is that these really don't look very good because of their size. Even with the stretching, which is currently turned off because we loaded in a preset, so we can go back to velocity and stretch that out. The HyperVoxels themselves are a little bit too large. So what we might need to do is really increase the overall particle amount in order to get the best sort of an effect. And that way we can scale down the HyperVoxels and it will just end up looking a little bit better. The only thing is, calculating that with collision can take a little bit longer, especially on what kind of processor you're using, and that can play a huge role in the overall scene. And we can increase this particle size so everything kind of blends together, but we're still going to have some of these HyperVoxels and particles that are kind of by themselves, and it doesn't really give the most realistic look. So it will vary. There might be a lot of tweaking that needs to be done in order to get it to look correct. But at this point, I'm just going to kind of stick with the amount we have, and then we can always increase that later. And right now we can see with that stretch amount, it looks pretty good. We've got some really nice blending. We can see how it's curling over. Of course, a lot of this we're really not going to see. It's going to be blocked out. So let's take a look at a render and see how this is interacting with our view scene. And now there's a couple of things we can do to speed up renders while we're at this point of production. And basically what we want to do is decrease our render time by decreasing qualities. And a lot of the different qualities we don't need right now because we're just kind of looking at where certain objects fall and their relation to each other. So let's go over to the view interface, and we're going to make some changes. Now we can see there's a little bit of a display error here. So we just need to change our viewports, move that back, and now it looks alright. I just had to refresh that. But I'm going to go into the atmosphere editor and switch this. And now what it's asking me to do is right now the timeline is currently not set to 0 because we have our particles somewhat coming out. So it's asking us if we'd like to animate the atmosphere. I'm going to click no because I do not want this to be animated. I want this just to be a global setting right now where we can switch this back and forth. And now we can see the overall change in the scene based on that ambience rather than using the illumination, and basically we have a much brighter scene. So what you can do is modify some of these settings in the meantime and then come back and tweak them. But really something that's bright shouldn't be too bad. Maybe if we turn down just that sky dome lighting gain, we can start to get more of what we had before and what we're going to get with the final render. And then we'll increase that just a little bit towards sunlight. And that looks pretty good. So we're going to click OK. And we can see our resolution is at 800 by 450. And I currently have this set to the broadcast mode. I'm going to change that to final because a lot of those settings we really don't need to be that high. We could also use some of the user settings to really modify and speed up that render. But first we'll take a look at this one, and then we can turn off different settings really depending on what we want. And actually for right now I'm going to change that to preview. Click OK. And then if we switch back into Lightwave, we can go ahead and render out a frame. We'll take a look at the camera. See that anti-aliasing is off. We want to make sure that it currently is right now, and that volumetric anti-aliasing is off because we do not need those to process at this point. So we'll render out a frame, and then we can take a look at how it looks so far. And actually right now we can tell that our terrain needs to be removed and dissolved, so I'm just going to abort that render, go into our object properties, and for our terrain valley and our low poly, we need our object dissolve at 100 for both of them. And now we lose most of our preview, but once we render it, it won't show up because all we're really rendering is complete volumetrics. And if we take a look at the render right now, we can notice a very, very huge problem. And that is the HyperVoxels are being completely overlaid to our view scene. And we're not seeing any overlaps with our trees.